Hey everybody, it's Abishur Prakash, aka Mr. Geopolitics. Yesterday was the summit in Alaska between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. As I've said many times before, this was the most critical point in the Ukraine war since it began more than 3 years ago. However, most analysis seems to start and end with Putin won, America lost. There was far more that took place, far more that was revealed. I want to share my reaction with you minute by minute. Let's jump right in.
President of the United States of America and the President of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, our negotiations have been held in a constructive.
So this right here, right off the bat, was quite unexpected. Usually in press conferences, the President of the United States always goes first. But here, Russia, the Russian leader, went first. A big sign, a new way that Putin can communicate to his people that Russia is still an important nation in the world, that Russia's leader went first. And all of this as Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. So the world's most sanctioned country, the leader of the world's most sanctioned country, is standing shoulder to shoulder with the most powerful man in the world. And when it came to the first press conference that these two leaders have had in years, Russia went first. So optics is everywhere.
Atmosphere of mutual respect. We have very thorough negotiations that were quite useful. I would like to thank once again my American counterpart for the proposal to travel out here to Alaska. It only makes sense that we've met here because our countries, though separated by the oceans, are close neighbors. So when we've met, when I came out of the plane and I've said, "Good afternoon, dear neighbor. Very good to see you, in good health, and to see you alive." I think that is very neighborly. And I think that's some kind words that we can say to each other. We're separated by the Strait of Bering, though there are 2 islands only between the Russian.
This is setting the stage for what Putin's about to do. He's going to play his classic card, which is talking about history. Right now, he is simply pouring minimal praise compared to what he's about to do on Trump. And alongside that, he's talking about just the general proximity between the US and Russia. And this is something that's often overlooked, considering the spotlight is always on US-China or what's happening in the Middle East or the wars like India-Pakistan. But Russia and the US are now locked in a strategic competition, far bigger than Ukraine, and I'll get into that later. But this is a competition that is as significant as US-China or India-China. And within this, Russia and America are neighbors. They are very close to each other through Alaska. And this is a point that's often overlooked in geopolitical circles and in analysis of US-Russia.
Island and the U.S. island, they're only 4 kilometers apart. We're close neighbors, and it's a fact. It's also important that Alaska has to do with our common heritage, common history between Russia and the U.S., and many positive events have to do with that territory. Still, there is tremendous cultural heritage back from the Russian America. For example, Orthodox churches and a lot of more than 700 geographical names of Russian origin.
So this is what I mean by classic Putin, which is that the Russian leader likes to talk about history, using history as the opening for setting the scene about what he wants to discuss. And he's going to repeat this when it comes to Ukraine. This is something that the world saw when Putin was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, when Putin spent 30 to 40 to 50 minutes discussing history and using that as a basis to justify Russia's geopolitics today. So Putin is once again indirectly bringing in the Cold War, bringing in the Soviet era footprint of the world to discuss the current challenges plaguing US-Russia relations.
During the Second World War, it was here in Alaska that was the origin of the legendary air bridge for the supply of military aircraft and other equipment under the Lend-Lease program. There was a dangerous and treacherous route over the vast emptiness of ice. However, the pilots of both countries did everything to bring closer the victory. They risked their lives and they gave it all for the common victory. I was just in the city of Magadan in Russia, and there is a memorial there dedicated to the Russian and the U.S. pilots. And there are two flags, the U.S. flag and the Russian flag. And I know that here as well there is such a memorial. There is a military burial place several kilometers away from here.
What he's really doing now is talking about US-Russia relations from a very different angle. Instead of talking about US-Russia relations today, which are at an all-time low, he's trying to invoke US-Russia relations through the lens of positivity, through the lens of cooperation. Now, whether this is something that the audience in the room and the broader audience listened will see, likely this was missed, but this is what the Russian leader is trying to do here.
The Soviet pilots that buried there who died during that dangerous mission, we're thankful to the citizens and the government of the U.S. for carefully taking care of their memory. I think that's very worthy and noble. We'll always remember other historical examples when our countries defeated common enemies together in the spirit of battle camaraderie and allyship that supported each other and facilitated each other. I'm sure that this heritage will help us rebuild and foster mutually beneficial and equal ties at this new stage, even during the hardest conditions. It is known that there have been no summits between Russia and the U.S. for 4 years, and that's a long time. This time was very hard for bilateral relations, and let's be frank, they have fallen to the lowest point since the Cold War. I think that's not benefiting our countries and the world as a whole. It is apparent that sooner or later we had to amend the situation to move on from the confrontation to dialogue, and in this case, a personal meeting between the...
This is quite an important statement the Russian leader is making. He is publicly acknowledging that US-Russia relations are at an all-time low. He's not laying blame. He's not leaning towards a particular side. He's simply saying that the state of play between Washington and Moscow, not just over Ukraine, but geoeconomically too, i.e. the Sino-Russia alliance and how that's resulting in a new kind of geopolitical flashpoint between the West and China, the West and Russia. All of this taken together represents a different era that the world is in. And in this era, the US and Russia are as far apart as they were during the Cold War. And without saying it, Putin is pointing to how do we get out of this? What is the path forward from here from the Russian geostrategy? How should Russia maneuver this? And without saying it, Putin is saying that the time has come to change the status quo. The time has come after more than 4 years. 4 years is quite a while. However, the US-Russia relations have been in decline since 2014 after Russia annexed Crimea. So this is now almost a decade of constant collision, locking horns, not just over Ukraine. In 2013, 2014, 2015, it was Syria, and then it's Iran, then it's Ukraine, then it's North Korea. It's constantly bouncing between different geographies of the world, and the outcome is that US-Russia relations are not just constantly in free fall, but the US and Russia are returning to their old Cold War positions in how they view one another.
The heads of state has been long overdue, naturally, under the condition of serious and painstaking work, and this work has been done in general. Me and President Trump have very good direct contact. We've spoken multiple times. We spoke frankly on the phone. And Special Envoy of the president, Mr. Witkoff, traveled out to Russia several times. Our advisors and heads of foreign ministries kept in touch all the time. And you know fully well that one of the central issues was the situation around Ukraine. We see the strive of the...
This is very important. This is framing. This is geopolitical framing, where Putin is saying that Ukraine is one of these central issues. This is a very calculated play on words. It's clear that Ukraine is the central issue. Ukraine is the reason why these two leaders are meeting. But by saying that Ukraine is one of the central issues, the Russian leader is effectively making it clear that there is a bigger picture here, that there is other areas, other topics, other headaches that Moscow and Washington are discussing, are moving on, are exploring, are trying to solve. So this is optics, but this is also a window into how the US and Russia are discussing things, as was made clear that even though there has not been a joint summit like this in years, that the US and Russian leaders have spoken multiple times, but more importantly, that their staff, their top officials, are in constant contact. And this is a reflection, and this goes to the bigger diplomatic changes in the world, where diplomacy is now being driven in a very unilateral way, that nations are no longer turning to the United Nations, to global forums, to resolve challenges, that they're instead trying to work either directly with the party they have problems with, or are turning to very exclusive, very small, very tribal settings, i.e. blocks like BRICS, i.e. the G7 working, or even new groupings that are being designed for the world.
Administration and President Trump personally to help facilitate the resolution of the Ukrainian conflict, and his strive to get to the crux of the matter, to understand this history, is precious. As I've said, the situation in Ukraine has to do with fundamental threats to our security. Moreover, we've always considered the Ukrainian nation, and I've said it multiple times, a brotherly nation, however strange it may sound in these conditions.
This is more than strange, but Putin is using this as a very rare opportunity to speak directly to the American people. This is, for those that have listened to his previous speeches, his previous press conferences, his previous interviews, this is how he views the Ukraine situation, that the Ukrainian heritage overlaps with Russia in a way that justifies what's taking place today. This is a story, this is a narrative, true or not, that Putin has been speaking to global media about at different venues, like the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. But this is now very different. Putin has in the room in front of him all of American media, all of Western media, and more broadly, the US citizen, who he can speak to directly through these media outlets. So Putin is leveraging this opportunity to tell a certain story as to why Russia is doing what it's doing in Ukraine. Of course, there is far more to this than what's being said.
We have the same roots, and everything that's happening is a tragedy for us and terrible wound. Therefore, the country is sincerely interested in putting an end to it. At the same time, we're convinced that in order to make the settlement lasting and long-term, we need to eliminate all the primary roots, the primary causes of that conflict. And we've said it multiple times.
This is the single most important line in Putin's part of the speech, that Russia has to eliminate the primary causes of the conflict. Now, this is a rabbit hole. What are the primary causes? This was started as a special operation in February 2022 to stamp out what Putin said was fascism, was neo-Nazis in eastern Ukraine that threatened Russia. Now, of course, there's far more to why Russia has done what it's done in Ukraine, invaded Ukraine, why this war broke out. And this has to do with security concerns that Moscow has, namely Ukraine joining NATO, mainly the expansion of NATO into what Russia believes is its backyard. This cannot be solved through even a ceasefire deal between Kyiv and Moscow, even if Zelensky agrees to the most outlandish conditions, i.e. giving up the occupied lands that Russia now controls, giving up Ukrainian territory that Russia now occupies and controls. Even if Zelensky agrees to that, this is a different setup, a different agreement to appease Russia's security concerns. And this puts Trump, the US, and the West in a very challenging position, which is how far do they go to meet what Putin wants, which is a redesign of Western security footprint, Western security architecture, and Western security thinking in Europe. And by doing that, it will redesign the Western ability to call the shots, not just in Europe, but all of Eurasia. So this is very much being framed around Ukraine. But the solution to what Putin is saying goes well beyond Ukraine.
To consider all legitimate concerns of Russia and to reinstate a just balance of security in Europe and in the world on the whole. And I agree with President Trump, as he has said today, that naturally the security of Ukraine should be ensured as well.
That's also a very significant point, that this is two different geopolitical concerns. The first has to do with Russia's security beliefs, Russia's security fears about NATO's easternward expansion, about Ukraine potentially joining NATO. That door remains open. It's something that's still being openly discussed and annoys, to put it mildly, policymakers in Moscow, defense officials in Moscow. That's one headache. But the second headache, which is key to solving the war in Ukraine, is who should guarantee Ukraine's security long term. If NATO is out of the question, if Ukraine is banned from joining NATO, which is likely one of the conditions that the Russian side is putting forward, that Ukraine can never be allowed to join NATO, if that's agreed to, then NATO can not guarantee long-term security in Ukraine. NATO may continue through indirect means, i.e. specific NATO states, France, Germany, Italy, providing support, providing arms, providing rebuilding, providing capital. But NATO cannot have a direct stake in Ukraine. And this puts the onus largely on the US and to a lesser degree Europe in this specific instance, which could change very quickly. But for now, the onus is on the US to guarantee Ukraine's security long term. What this means is very gray. Guaranteeing the security of a nation is no easy task, and it requires a long-term permanent footprint of the US in Ukraine, whether it's through drones, whether it's through Air Force, whether it's through boots on the ground, whether it's through other types of systems and approaches. It will require the US to dedicate strategic resources to Ukraine. So on one hand, this creates a bit of a dilemma where on one hand, the Russians don't want Ukraine in NATO, largely because of NATO's easternward expansion, the power of NATO to define the outlook of its member states, i.e. treating Russia as an adversary. But on the other hand, even if Ukraine is not part of NATO and America is guaranteeing Ukraine's security, it puts America's military footprint on the edge of Russia's border in a new way. So this is not black and white. This is very gray. This is very fluid. And it seems almost at times very contradictory, as one nation wants one thing, but by doing that one thing, another nation has to move differently, which ends up contradicting initially what that country wanted.
Truly, we are prepared to work on that. I would like to hope that the agreement that we've reached together will help us bring closer that goal and will pave the path towards peace in Ukraine. We expect that Kiev and European capitals will perceive that constructively and that they won't throw a wrench in the works.
Another key point, and this is, as I said at the beginning of the video, there's so much being said at this summit, both verbally and non-verbally. But in this key point, what the Russians are trying to say here, reading between the lines, is that Europe needs to follow what America is doing. That if Europe rejects what the US is trying to do here, then it will sideline talks and cause a protracted war, even more protracted than it already is. Now, Europe is in a very awkward position right now because Europe hasn't even been invited to the talks to solve the war in Europe, meaning Europe wants America's help to solve the Ukraine war, but America doesn't want Europe's help to solve the Ukraine war. So Europe is not even in the direct discussions about a conflict taking place in its own backyard, on its own soil. But B is that if the US decides to, as part of the peace deal, to lift certain sanctions on Russia, which are likely to revolve initially around energy and agriculture, and potentially certain commodities like metals, like critical minerals, if the US does this, then Europe will have to decide, does it keep the red tape around Russia, or does it also begin to retract the sanctions? So far, Europe has said it's not going to walk away from sanctions, which is exactly the opposite of what Putin is saying in this press conference.
They will not make any attempts to use some backroom dealings to conduct provocations to torpedo the nascent progress. Incidentally, when the new administration came to power, bilateral trade started to grow. This
is more praising Trump, more showering him with praise. Part of a lot of folks know that this is part of Putin's charm offensive, but there's a couple of key points here. First is that US-Russia trade has nosedived. And not just because of the Ukraine war, even before that, it was in decline. In certain months, the US is exporting 10 or 20 or $30 million worth of goods to Russia. Meanwhile, the US is buying hundreds of millions of goods from Russia. So there is a strategic shift that has taken place between the US and Russian economies, where Russia is buying almost nothing from America in most months, but the US is still buying a lot from Russia. And this is likely to be one of the corridors that Trump leverages if the war fails to end, if tensions shoot back up between the US and Russia, which is America stops buying goods from Russia, America bans certain imports. However, considering even at $100 or $200 million a month in imports, that scale is still so small to have a dent. So US-Russia trade relations have truly reached a point where neither side is increasingly reliant on the other. And there's huge opportunity for growth here if certain situations can be resolved.
Very symbolic. Still, we have a growth of 20%. As I've said, we have a lot of dimensions for joint work. It is clear that the U.S. and Russian investment and business cooperation has tremendous potential. Russia and the U.S. can offer each other so much in trade, digital, high-tech, and in space exploration. We see that Arctic cooperation is also very possible, and
So Putin is mentioning a couple of key geopolitical arenas here, namely tech and the Arctic. Now, the U.S., since Trump was inaugurated in January, has put AI at the top of its agenda in terms of ensuring the U.S. can continue calling the shots around the world. In fact, Trump's tour of Gulf states revolved largely around AI. and around and through these AI deals, rolling back China's technology footprint in the Middle East. Putin is saying that there's an opportunity here for some kind of AI, some kind of new AI-based partnership relationship, which is likely to revolve around the US exporting AI to Russia. Now, this is no easy task, in large part because the US does not want its advanced technology to fall in the hands of China. By sending it to Russia, it almost guarantees that the Chinese will have unfettered access to America's most advanced exports. The Arctic is critical as well. Before the summit, the US proposed that there could be some kind of cooperation between the US and Russia when it comes to critical minerals in the Arctic, mining these critical minerals in the Arctic. The Arctic is becoming so significant in terms of global shipping and defense. Russians in certain capacity exceed the Western security footprint in the Arctic. The Russians have rebuilt, have renovated many Cold War era bases in the Arctic region. The Russians have significant amount of icebreakers. The US and the West do not. So if there can be some kind of consensus on stability in the Arctic, it will provide the long-term incentive for economic growth. But connected to the Arctic is China. The Chinese need access to the Arctic to cut shipping times, to open up a new kind of geoeconomics for the Chinese government. And a large part of China's strategy hinges on Russia. And Russia is here opening up the idea that it could align in certain ways with the US when it comes to the Arctic. Of course, this is simply words at this point, but the door is being opened to such ideas, while before the summit, they were completely closed.
International context, for example, between the Far East of Russia and the West Coast of the US. Overall, it's very important for our countries to turn the page, to go back to cooperation. It is symbolic that not far away from here, at the border between Russia and the US, there was a so-called international date line. I think you can step over literally from yesterday into tomorrow. And I hope that will succeed in that. In political sphere, I would like to thank President Trump for our joint work, for the well-wishing and trustworthy tone of our conversation. It's important that both sides are result-oriented, and we see that the President of the US has a very clear idea of what he would like to achieve. He sincerely cares about prosperity of his nation. Still, he understands that Russia has its own national interests. I expect that today's agreements will be the starting point, not only for the solution of the Ukrainian issue, but also will help us bring back business-like and pragmatic relations between Russia and the US. And in the end, I would like to add one more thing. I'd like to remind you that in 2022, during the last contact with the previous administration, I tried to convince my previous American colleague that the situation should not be brought to the point of no return when it would come to hostilities. And I said it quite directly back then that it's a big mistake. Today, when President Trump saying that if he was the president back then, there will be no war. And I'm quite sure that it would indeed be so.
This is equally profound, that the president of Russia is effectively repeating a line that the president of the United States has said many times, which is that if he, being Trump, were in power in 2022, the war in Ukraine wouldn't have broken out. Now, in 2022, there was one moment that largely defined where this statement comes from, which is when then US President Joe Biden said that if the Russians make a minor incursion, it could be accepted. It could be something that the US overlooks. This was effectively giving the Russians a green light to go into Ukraine, and it's something that the Biden administration never recovered from. It was viewed as one of the great catastrophes of American foreign policy. But the idea that if Trump was in office, this war wouldn't have broken out is very loose and hard to accept for several reasons. First, this war didn't begin in 2022. The invasion, the full-scale invasion, began in 2022, but this is a war that began in 2013 and 2014, starting with the protests and the ousting of governments in Kyiv, then the annexation of Crimea, and then the escalating fighting in eastern Ukraine. In fact, solving the fighting in eastern Ukraine was one of the campaign pledges that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky ran on when he decided to run for office. So this is how significant that fighting was in terms of the Ukrainian and the Russian geopolitics. In tandem to that is that the Russians appear to have been preparing for some kind of major geopolitical event for some time now. And there's three key signs of this. The first is that in 2014, the Russians began building their own version of SWIFT. SWIFT is the global network, the global system that enables money to move around the world. It's a messaging system that underpins global capital movements, and it's something that has been partially cut off from Russia as part of the Western sanctions. So being cut off from SWIFT means that a country cannot do business with the global economy with the same ease, with the same efficiency, with the same speed that it could with SWIFT. Now, not all of Russia has been cut off from SWIFT. Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, remains accessible, remains open and connected to the SWIFT network. But the point is that Russia, since 2014, has been building its own SWIFT system, SPFS, with the intention and the idea and the understanding that at some future date, because of some future event, Russia could be cut off from SWIFT. Second, the Russians have been building a sovereign internet. That means the Russians have been building their own national internet system that can operate even if Russia doesn't have access to the World Wide Web. And the goal, the stated goal of Russia's sovereign internet, which was tested at the end of 2019, the stated goal was that if a future event takes place where Russia is sanctioned, that the Russian internet can survive, and therefore the Russian economic stability and social stability remains intact. And the third sign is that there have been several reports that the Russians were planning for Ukraine since 2019, including redesigning the entire defense foundation and architecture that Russia has on the border with Ukraine, including building new hospitals, etc. So all of this taken together shows that the Russians, A, have been fighting with Ukraine for almost a decade, and B, Russia has been taking strategic steps based on some, at that time, of some future event occurring that causes Russia to be effectively at war, if anything, just economically, with the West, which causes global systems to be cut off from Russia, which causes Russia to be in a very new situation. And added to all of this, which is that Biden made the minor incursion comment in January 2022 on the eve of Russia invading Ukraine. But Russia was building up its forces around Ukraine since March or April 2021. So the buildup took place for almost 8 to 9 months before Biden made his comment. So the idea that if Trump was in office, or that if Biden didn't make that comment, that Russia would have never invaded. Well, Russia was already building up its forces on the border even before Biden made that comment. And Russia was already engaged in preparing for a major geopolitical event, even when Trump was in office during his first term.
I can confirm that. I think that overall, me and President Trump have built a very good, businesslike, and trustworthy contact. And I have every reason to believe that moving down this path, we can come, and the sooner the better, to the end of the conflict in Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. That was very profound. And I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that
I'll just say right off the bat that Trump's body language and Trump's tone sounds far more subdued than Putin. Putin seems to have energy. Putin seems to have charisma. Trump, on the other hand, who is usually naturally very charismatic, naturally a very high energy person, in this specific instance seems to be a little bit more reserved in how he's talking.
agreed on most of them, I would say. A couple of big ones that we haven't quite gotten there, but we've.
And that's right there, that statement that they've agreed on a lot, but there's a couple of big ones that they haven't agreed on, is the biggest clue as to whether a deal can be inked or not. And clearly, a deal cannot be inked. And as far as what these big areas of diversion are, the biggest is whether the two biggest is the future of security around Ukraine, which has to do with whether Ukraine will be in NATO, which has to do with who will guarantee Ukraine's security and future. And the second has to do with the land that Russians currently occupy and Ukrainians have said they will never give up fighting for. So Ukraine, and this is also part of America's own calculation as to whether it can unilaterally agree to Russia's conditions or whether Russia's conditions expand the purview and require the involvement of other states, namely European governments and Ukraine itself. So unless these specific issues are inked out, which are the most important issues, the Ukraine war will be further and further away from peace.
Made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting. It's ultimately up to them. They're going to have to agree with what Marco and Steve and some of the great people from the Trump administration who've come here, Scott and John Radcliffe. Thank you very much. But we have some of our really great leaders. They've been doing a phenomenal job. We also have some tremendous Russian business representatives here. And I think, everybody wants to deal with us. We've become the hottest country anywhere in the world in a very short period of time. And we look forward to that. We look forward to dealing. We're going to try and get this over with. We really made some great progress today. I've always had a fantastic relationship with President Putin, with Vladimir. We had many tough meetings, good meetings. We were interfered with by the Russia hoax that made it.
So this is just as Putin has classic Putin, where he brings up history and the basis, uses it as a basis to justify what's happening today. So too, this is classic Trump, of turning the spotlight back to the U.S. national affairs, back to his own personal experiences, like in U.S. politics with Russia. However, there is a door that Trump is opening with these comments regarding the Russian business community, which is that if the Ukraine war can be solved, and if America decides to unilaterally remove sanctions on the Russian economy, starting with energy and agriculture, or holistically removing large amounts of the red tape, then business, meaning trade, meaning investments, could be the new foundation for U.S.-Russia relations. And without saying it the same way as Putin, Putin is effectively calling for a reset in U.S.-Russia relations, similar to what took place during the Obama years, but on a much bigger scale in a much different time period. Similarly, Trump here is saying that if these friction points can be resolved, then the door is open to both U.S. investment in Russia and Russian investment in the U.S. And this is a corridor, U.S.-Russia, that regarding the economics of both sides, that does not get enough attention, largely because Russia has been sidelined. Russia has become the world's most sanctioned country, and doing business with Russia is becoming increasingly more difficult. Doing business with Russia requires potentially trading with the shadow fleet. All of this is a gray area, legally speaking. But if all of that is removed, then the US-Russia economic relationship could begin to define not just the US and Russia themselves, but different various regions of the world, like the Arctic, like parts of Eurasia. And this will become a big geopolitical factor that other nations have to take into consideration.
A little bit tougher to deal with, but he understood it. I think he's probably seen things like that during the course of his career. He's seen it all. But we had to put up with the Russia hoax. He knew it was a hoax, and I knew it was a hoax. But what was done was very criminal. But it made it harder for us to deal as a country in terms of the business and all of the things that we'd like to have dealt with. But we'll have a good chance when this is over. So just to put it very quickly, I'm going to start making a few phone calls and tell them what happened. But we had an extremely productive meeting, and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant, but we have a very good chance of getting there. We didn't get there, but we have a very good chance of getting there. I would like to thank President Putin and his entire team, whose faces, who I know in many cases, other than that, whose faces I get to see all the time in the newspapers. You're almost as famous as the boss, but especially this one right over here. But we had some good meetings over the years, right? Good, productive meetings over the years, and we hope to have that in the future. But let's do the most productive one right now. We're going to stop really 5, 6, 7,000, thousands of people a week from being killed, and President Putin wants to see that as much as I do. So, again, Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
And next time in Moscow.
This is the most important part of the entire summit. And there's several reasons for it, but two in particular require special attention. The first is that Putin oftentimes reserves speaking English for very important moments. You can count the number of times Putin has spoken English publicly. Oftentimes, the Russian leader talks in Russian and maintains the use of translation. However, this doesn't mean that Putin doesn't understand English and Putin doesn't know what's going on. So by speaking in English, Putin is indirectly making it clear to everybody that he knows exactly what's being said, exactly what's going on, that he's very, very aware both about the verbal comments being made and the body language, and is fully in control, that there's no space between him and what's happening. The second most important reason to explain what Putin did is that by inviting Trump to Moscow with no clear date, the true nature of this summit has been revealed, that this is about far more than Ukraine, that Ukraine may be the current reason for them to meet, but their meeting is going beyond Ukraine, and that both of these countries are attempting to redefine their relationship. They're attempting to look at the future through a new lens and enhance their cooperation and redefine how these nations behave with one another. So once again, Putin is calling effectively for a reset. And by inviting Trump to Moscow, the first inklings of this reset may be seen. The first projects that come out of this reset may be seen. And this is likely to alarm much of the West.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening. Thank you very much, Vladimir. And thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So that was the summit. It was several hours long. It was defined by both the worsening situation in Ukraine and the needs that both of these leaders have, something I've talked about in the past, which is that Putin wants to be re-legitimized in the world, and Trump wants to show to the world that he's trying to solve conflicts as part of his play to get a Nobel. So there's different interests that both sides have. So what should the world make of this? What does this mean? Well, it means a couple of things. First, yes, Putin won big. Russia, the world's most sanctioned country, went to a US military base on former Soviet territory to hold talks with the most powerful leader in the world, and Russia gave nothing. Russia did nothing except show up. So Putin is now able to show his domestic audience how important and strategic Russia is in the eyes of the US, but more importantly, the rest of the world that was clear-eyed as to whether they're going to continue doing business with Russia or whether they're going to try and isolate Russia, which hasn't happened, is now even more confused because the lines separating Russia from the most powerful economy, the most powerful nation in the world, those lines are blurring. And Russia is no longer this pariah state as it was in the eyes of the West, but it's also no longer this reliable state as can be seen by India attempting to diversify its oil supplies beyond Russia. So the world is once again thrown into this very gray area, into very tumultuous waters regarding exactly where does Russia fit in terms of the geopolitics. How far can countries go with Russia? Second is that the Ukraine war, the next days and weeks become pivotal. If there is a major attack in Russia or in Ukraine, that means by either side, then the talks will be sidelined. This is the last chance of diplomacy. This is the last card that can be played. It doesn't get any higher than the President of the United States and the President of Russia meeting to discuss the war. There is no other chain of command to go beyond this. So if this cannot result in some kind of peaceful resolution, which is what Putin wants. He wants a comprehensive peace plan, which goes back to long-term security guarantees that the West has to promise Moscow. If that doesn't materialize, in part because the both sides cannot agree or because there is a major attack in Russia or Ukraine, then the talks will fail and war will not just be the new status quo as it has been for 3 years, but the war will elevate to new levels. Third is that Europe is in a very unexpected position. I've touched on that during the video, that the Europeans want America's help to solve the Ukraine war, but America doesn't want Europe's help. And so Europe has to now figure out, A, will it lift the sanctions on Russia if America does the same, or if America takes the first step? Will Europe mimic the US? And second, if Ukraine refuses to heed the demands of the US that stem from the Alaska summit, namely that it can never join NATO and that it must give up the lands that Russia now controls, and if the US walks away from Ukraine, which is something that US Vice President J.D. Vance has signaled, has alluded to with certain remarks, because the US feels that it can't find a solution, that this is becoming a never-ending war, another forever war, then is Europe prepared to take responsibility for the Ukraine war, both in funding Ukraine, arming Ukraine, and defending Ukraine? So Europe is now in a very challenging position, and the runway for Europe to remain indecisive is running out. And last has to do with countries like China and India, who are watching this summit to try and gauge, A, is Trump going to be able to find a deal with Putin that removes the threat of secondary sanctions, or are tensions about to flare? If there's no deal and the US decides to double down with Kyiv and defend Ukraine from Russia, then it will do so by going after Russia's key trading partners. And this will have a cascading effect. For example, if the US goes after China, then US-China trade talks will be derailed. But connected to this, specifically for Beijing, is that its most strategic partner, if China has two allies in the world, it's North Korea and Russia. And Russia is far more significant to China than North Korea. And if the US and Russia are able to reset relations, if they're able to start working on strategic projects like rare earths, like AI, like space, and are putting their differences behind them, then it completely challenges and threatens the Sino-Russian relationship. The Sino-Russian relationship, the catalyst for it is not mutual trust. It's not history. The catalyst for the Sino-Russian relationship is dealing with America and America's bold behavior in the world and America's geopolitics. And if America's geopolitics are no longer cornering Russia and are no longer focused on taping up Russia with sanctions, then the Sino-Russian relationship loses a key driving force, the most critical driving force. So the Chinese are watching this very carefully, very acutely. And this is why I said previously that what takes place in Alaska will not just be limited to Ukraine, will have a domino effect on the world as nations are forced to adapt and adjust. So these are my comments, my reaction to the Trump-Putin summit. This was a historical event. For me, this felt like after the Soviet Union collapsed and the US met with Russia, Clinton met with Yeltsin. This is as significant considering the stakes, considering the new era the world is in. Leave your comments below and talk soon.